Welcome back from Christmas break. I trust that Santa decided you've been good last year, and please know we never share information with researchers from the North Pole. The last unit before break, we talked about what made revolutions revolutionary. So just to recap, why did I think that the French Revolution was revolutionary, while the election of Barack Obama, however historically significant, was not revolutionary? Well, the French Revolution ushered in a fundamental change in the principle not only of who would rule, but who had the right to rule. Napoleon messed with these principles pretty quickly, but the legitimacy of absolute monarchy was forever shaken. Similarly, earlier in the course, I argued that gunpowder was revolutionary. Why? Well, remember, it upended the feudal social order dominated by knights and castles that could now be knocked down in an afternoon's cannon barrage. In this unit, we're taking revolutionary change to a whole new level with the Industrial Revolution. Today, I'm going to argue that the Industrial Revolution was the most revolutionary of the revolutions we'll study in this course. That's a pretty strong claim, especially when you consider that we still have the Russian and Chinese revolutions ahead of us. I'm going to defend this claim that the Industrial Revolution was the most revolutionary with a series of graphs, charts, pictures. These visuals are reproduced in your notes templates, and your quizzes are going to focus on understanding and interpreting this visual evidence. So pay attention and take notes, okay? But to help you out, let me start with a brief introductory clip from the crash course on the Industrial Revolution. This is a complicated graph, sorry, but it tells a very important story. So just to help you interpret the graph, what do the numbers on the left-hand side, that is the y-axis, represent? The word share should give you a clue. Those numbers are percents, the fraction of 100 of total manufacturing output represented by 5 countries. The UK, by the way, is Great Britain, or the combined country formed by England, Scotland, Wales, and Northern Ireland, which were formally united in 1801. So in percentage terms, what country is on top in the year 1 CE? Well, the answer is India, clearly, with China a pretty close second. Germany and England barely show up on the graph, and of course the United States isn't around yet. The Roman Empire, no doubt, would have had a substantial share of manufacturing output, but it wasn't included in the graph. So what about the year 1800, well into the period that the video we just saw defined as the first Industrial Revolution? Well, China has overtaken India, and European countries are finally showing up on the graph. But in terms of the percentage of world manufacturing output, what would become the 2 leading European manufacturing powers, that is, Germany and England, are still behind until the mid-1800s when they take off. And of course, by the 20th century, a newcomer, the United States, has moved into the lead. So here is a tougher but really important question. Why is this graph a very misleading picture of the changes in the world economy? The short video clip you just saw should have given you a hint. So I realize these charts aren't completely comparable. We've lost Germany, we've added the Netherlands, which was Europe's greatest commercial power in the 17th and early 18th centuries. But the graph still tells an important story. To understand it, you need to know what GDP, or gross domestic product, is. And what is it? You hear that term a lot on the news a lot. Do you know what it means? GDP is a measure of the total product of an economy. Basically, it's the quantity of stuff produced, the number of bales of wool or pounds of grain, etc., multiplied by the price that the stuff sells for, adjusted for changes in the value of money. So, for example, $1 buys a lot less now than it did when I was in high school due to inflation. Most good GDP graphs will adjust for this change, so we just see the change in total economic product. GDP per person is that total economic product number divided by population. And why might that be a more revealing number than just total GDP? Well, if the population is growing faster than the economy, the country is still getting poorer, especially the people at the bottom of the social ladder. So what is the most important single thing we learn from this graph? And I'll give you a hint. It is not the great divergence between Europe and India and China. What this graph really shows is the sheer amount of goods produced per person, or as we say, per capita, begins to increase very, very sharply. And until the last few decades, almost all of that increase occurred in Europe. This growth in economic output per person is even more impressive when you consider that the population exploded after 1800. And that's what the graph on top shows. I put the other graph below it so you can compare them. So how might these two huge bursts of growth in population, growth in economic output, be related? Well, basically, an economy that has produced much more in the way of goods and services can also support a larger population. With more abundance, people produce more babies, and those babies, thanks in no small part to the scientific advances that were also part of the Industrial Revolution, are much more likely to survive. People live much longer, too, for the same reason. So, is this looking pretty revolutionary to you yet? As I was hunting around for good Industrial Revolution charts, I happened upon what I think is a great animated chart explained by Swedish statistician Hans Rosling. This is not just an entertaining way to look at statistics, it also brings us up to the present. As you watch this video clip, pay special attention to what is on the vertical or y-axis and what is on the horizontal or x-axis. You might just have to know that. Hint, hint, and of course it's labeled here on this chart. By the way, if you'd like to practice playing with this graph or looking at how different countries changed over time, we've posted a website in Moodle that lets you do just that. It has an incredibly long URL, so I haven't tried to fit it on this slide. There wouldn't be any room for the graph. So, to return to our basic question, what is revolutionary about the Industrial Revolution? It represents a very significant shift in the balance of economic power toward Europe and especially Britain. In a few decades, another major industrial power will arise, which is the United States, which is why you'll return to the Industrial Revolution history class next year. But much more importantly, as the video you just watched shows, this period represents a dramatic increase in total economic product, though initially, again, just for the countries of Western Europe and the United States. So this graph shows a little more clearly how the economic gap between Europe and the former industrial leaders, India and China, grew in the period we'll study in the next 2 weeks. Note that this graph reduces the time frame, and it also adds a few more European countries while still giving data for the former manufacturing powerhouses, India and China. What these graphs are basically telling us, again, is that a few centuries ago, it would have been difficult to tell Europe apart from the rest of the world, in economic terms at least. As the earlier chart showed us, 1,000 years ago, Europe was pretty significantly behind. The famous socialist economic thinker Karl Marx says that 3 inventions ushered in bourgeois European society. And guess what they were? Gunpowder, the compass, and the printing press. And note, they were probably all invented in China, not in Europe, but it was in Europe that the applications for these inventions really took off. By the 19th century, things are rather different. Western Europe and parts of North America become fabulously wealthy, and almost every place else remain relatively poor. Economic historians refer to this as the Great Divergence. There are also a lot of arguments about why this great divergence happened. One argument that doesn't hold up particularly well is that Europeans were somehow smarter and more creative. Let's hear from our crash course guy again. So, there's actually a really big debate among historians about why Europe first experienced an industrial revolution and economically surged way ahead of the rest of the world. I'm going to present a lot of possible reasons without coming down firmly on any one side. In other words, I'm going to present the all of the above theory. I think that's often the right theory in history. But there's one reason for Europe's and especially England's spectacular economic growth that almost everyone agrees on, and it shows up in the next 2 charts. So, what very significant change does this graph illustrate? annual energy consumption per head, that is per person in England, more than triple between 700 and 1860. So why does energy matter? You may remember from your science classes that all work, growing crops, making cannons, building great cathedrals, requires energy. And up until the Industrial Revolution, where did most of that energy come from? It came from human or animal power, sometimes from water power, mills, water wheels, places where there's running water. But human, animal, and even water power could only increase the amount of work that be accomplished so much. The Industrial Revolution was, above all else, the vast expansion of available energy combined with the invention of new machines that harnessed that energy to produce more work and therefore more work product. And where, according to this chart, did most of that energy come from? It came from coal. Let's watch the first part of the video on the Industrial Revolution in Britain and the crucial role of coal. So here's another coal-related clue about why the Industrial Revolution ignited in Britain and not in China. By the way, to understand why this graph is significant, you really need to know that Newcastle is a city in northern England and a major center of coal mining. So, why is Newcastle or its neighboring territory a great place to build one of these newfangled factories that we're going to learn about in a few minutes? Well, it's near major coal fields, and the coal in these fields is reasonably close to the surface, so it is much, much less expensive to extract. So the chart on the bottom left shows the population explosion in 4 major British industrial cities, which I've circled in red on the map. So what do you notice about the location of these rapidly growing cities? I tried to make the legend clearer, by the way, but it's still pretty fuzzy. So let me just tell you that the greenish-gray splotches are coal fields, and that the industries represented in order are cotton and linen cloth, woolen cloth, copper mining, tin mining, iron mining, production of tableware, and shipbuilding. So, as you see, I hope, most of the fastest growing industrial cities are located quite close to coal fields. And again, as you just heard on the video, a lot of British coal was pretty close to the surface and therefore easier and less expensive to extract. But much of the coal was further down, and that also helped create an industrial revolution. Why? You just saw this. It created a need for stronger pumps in coal mines to pump the water out, the water that appeared at these lower levels. And what did that lead to? Well, it led to the invention and improvement of steam engines. We're going to see this pattern over and over. One new technology creates a need for another technology to make it more useful, to increase energy, to make manufacturing more efficient, and the whole process led to an explosion of innovation and of cities. By the way, we're going to return to the revolutionary consequences of urbanization, that is, the growth of large industrial cities, but for now, let's continue with the early story of the Industrial Revolution. So, coal was a more efficient source of heat energy, but what made coal really transformative was the way it was used to heat water for steam and the invention of machines that were driven by steam. On the left, you see Newcomen's original and highly inefficient steam engine used to pump water out of coal mines, and on the right is James Watt's much improved version. Let's return to our video. I'm going to skip over a section I hope to return to later, which talks about how closely the Industrial Revolution was related both to the Scientific Revolution and to the Enlightenment and the Age of Reason. You're going to hear a reference to the Luna Society at the beginning of this clip. The Luna Society was one of many informal science clubs that sprang up all over England during the Enlightenment. By the way, this group called themselves the Luna Society. Luna was a Latin word for moon, because they could only meet on nights when the moon was full and they could find their way home. We haven't gotten to electricity yet. That, together with the internal combustion engine and major advancements in chemistry, will create the second industrial revolution. And that won't happen until the end of the 19th and the beginning of the 20th century. Stay tuned. So how does steam power make machines run anyway? This is an animated look at the Watt steam engine from a British Science Museum, and I thought it was cool, so take a look. Coal and steam energy the steam energy it produced was the great engine of the Industrial Revolution, but the first industry to be transformed was actually the textile industry. Now, textiles were not a new industry. Wool and wool cloth were England's leading products. Silk production was a very important manufacturing industry in France. Both England and France had been exporting textiles for hundreds of years. This is a picture from around 1770 of Scottish women fulling or cleaning wool. But before the Industrial Revolution, Britain's cloth production, wool, linen, and increasingly even cotton, took place almost entirely in the home in what was called the domestic system. So what seems to be happening in this picture? Well, we see a typical domestic system home. The single room is dominated by a spinning wheel, which is being worked by a young woman, probably an unmarried daughter of the house. We also see food being cooked in the same room. Other homes would have a weaving loom to turn spun thread into cloth. So what would you guess were the advantages of the domestic system, what's sometimes also called cottage industry? Not surprisingly, it took place in cottages. Well, the workers involved could work at their own speed while at home near their own home. Families worked together, so children could be supervised by their parents, and they were often probably better treated in the system than they would be in the factories, assuming their parents were kinder than factory foremen, which wasn't always true. The workers could open and close their own windows, they could work at their own speed, they could rest when they needed to, they had control over when they took their meals, and they could have their meals at home. Finally, workers could identify an individual product as more or less entirely their own work. Daniel Defoe, this is the fellow who wrote Robinson Crusoe, was a big fan of the domestic system. He describes it in a book he wrote about touring through Great Britain in 1724. Note the section I've underlined. What is one reason why he likes the domestic system so much? Well, he likes it because everybody can work. Children as young as 4 years old, very old women. It's worth keeping this in mind when we talk about child labor in the factories. But the domestic system had some important economic disadvantages, which is why once new technology and energy sources emerged, home production was rather quickly replaced with factory production. We see that here. In a minute, we're going to see another video clip about the growth of a mechanized textile industry. But first, try to guess what were the advantages that the factory created. Well, domestic production was very slow, and the finished product was simply not enough, particularly in the case of textiles, to clothe the fast-growing population of the United Kingdom or to meet the demand for textiles. So let's turn to another video and look at the birth of the mechanized textile industry. We're going to continue the story of the textile industry in a minute, but first, let's take a look at a few more images and the story they tell. First, the very beginning of the last video clip gave another reason why the Industrial Revolution was so revolutionary. How did cotton dramatically change the way people lived? It sounds really simple, but it did represent an extraordinary change in people's lives. Cotton could be easily washed, and once the Industrial Revolution was underway, it could be very cheaply produced. So it used to be that people had one or two, at most two changes of woolen clothing. In fact, many people sewed themselves into woolen underwear for the winter and kept it on all winter, never changing it. Yes, there were flaps, but still, as you should have also learned from the video, cotton used to be quite expensive to produce. Partly, of course, because it was mostly transported actually from India, so you added the transportation costs. Cotton muslins were lightweight, they were easily printed with colorful designs, they were easily laundered, but they were mostly imported from India and they cost a lot of money. So who wore cotton clothing? These pictures of women in cotton dresses might give you a clue. Before the Industrial Revolution, only the wealthy could afford cotton. Having a cotton dress was a sign of wealth and social status. Here are some early 18th century paintings of women wearing cotton clothing. And here is a print of a St. Giles beauty, also dressed in cotton. Is she wealthy? And how can you tell? Well, if you look closely, you'll see cracks in the ceiling and torn curtains over her bed. The way her dress is gaping open and her inviting smile should also tell you something else about this young woman. She is almost certainly a prostitute. St. Giles was a notorious slum and a center of prostitution. But for my purposes, what's interesting about this picture is that she's wearing cotton clothing. How is that possible? We get an answer from this chart. The beginning of it at any rate. It's pretty straightforward. Cotton consumption exploded in the early 19th century, and that's when cotton factories started popping up all over England. But that alone is not enough explanation of why a poor woman in a slum could afford a cotton dress. What else would you guess was happening? What does this graph show? The price of cotton dropped sixfold between 1780 and 1830. Do you remember what that term deflated means? Again, it means that the economist who produced this chart gave the costs in constant money. He or she adjusted for changes in the value of a shilling, so we can see the price decline without the complications of changes in the value of the currency. So let's return now to the story of how cheap cotton for the masses became popular. As you watch this clip, I want you to pay attention to Arkwright's personal background. What did he do before he became a cotton manufacturer? So now that you've seen the video, what did Arkwright do? Well, he was one of 13 children, and his family was too poor to send him to school. A cousin taught him how to read. He began his working career as apprentice to a barber, where, by the way, he quickly figured out a new and better way to dye wigs. This modest background and interest in finding practical improvements was typical of the Industrial Revolution pioneers. So how would you guess this affected the social structure of England, America, and other industrial countries? Well, suddenly people who were anything but aristocratic in their background were earning huge sums of money. That gave them a lot of power, and it helped drive a move toward more democratic politics, and we'll talk about more of that later. We're getting ahead of our story. Back to the textile industry. How does this chart support a point that was made in the video about Indian cotton spinners? The new mechanization cut British imports of Indian spun cotton in half. On the other hand, British exports or overseas sales of cotton increased almost 80-fold. Wow. The reason? Mechanized cotton could not just be produced faster, it could be produced much more cheaply. So here's an interesting question. We saw from earlier slides that India had been the world manufacturing leader at the beginning of the Common Era and remained a major manufacturing power right up to the beginning of the Industrial Revolution. So why didn't India mechanize? It's actually a question that economic historians still debate about, but the next chart suggests at least one answer. So what does this graph show about wages in England and India? British wages were approximately 6 times higher than Indian wages before the Industrial Revolution. Now, there are a lot of reasons for this. There was a big increase in agricultural production in England. There were larger amounts of money in circulation. There was a wider range of economic activity and therefore greater demand for workers. It's also worth noting that the difference in what economists call the grain wage, which is how much food a worker's wage could actually buy, was not nearly as great between India and Britain because food was cheaper in India. But since cloth was sold on the world market for silver, it was the money or silver wage that mattered. So why would higher wages in Britain help promote an industrial revolution? Well, it created an economic reason why people who were manufacturing cloth or other goods would look for ways to save labor, mostly by inventing machines where one person could produce a lot more product by operating the machine than by making that product by hand. India, which had much cheaper labor, had less reason to mechanize. So to recap, economic historians of the Industrial Revolution put a lot of emphasis on Britain's easy access to abundant coal and on the British drive to develop labor-saving machines because of higher British wages. Some also, however, emphasized the way British laws and institutions promoted economic development. I personally think that's also an important reason, and I'm going to talk about it in a follow-up lecture. But first, I want to finish the story of the textile revolution. So, we have new machines that spin and sort cotton thread. What is missing before we have a fully industrial textile industry? And what would steam have to do with it? Any guesses? The missing piece was weaving. In 1784, an English inventor, Edmund Cartwright, visited Richard Arkwright's factory. He was inspired by the way Cartwright had transformed spinning, had mechanized it. Cartwright began working on a machine that would improve the speed and quality of weaving. Employing a blacksmith and a carpenter, a lot of the Industrial Revolution was driven by skilled craftsmen, by the way. Cartwright managed to produce what he called a power loom. And you see a picture of it here. And then in 1787, Cartwright opened a weaving mill. 2 years later, and he made a number of improvements on the loom in that period. Continuous improvement was another part of the Industrial Revolution story. So 2 years later, Cartwright began using steam engines produced by James Watt to drive his looms. Further inventors improved on the looms, and by 1823, a textile manufacturer was able to claim that a boy or girl age 14 or 15 could manage 2 power looms and produce 3.5 times as much as the best hand loom weaver. By 1850, there were 250,000 cotton power looms in Britain, of which nearly 177,000 were in Lancashire. I'm leaving out some very important parts of the story, especially the impact of power looms on women, because most hand weavers had been women, and the impact on the children who went to work in these factories. Stay tuned. But before we get to the social consequences of the Industrial Revolution, I want to return to the question of why the Industrial Revolution began in Britain and suggest some other important reasons why this most revolutionary of revolutions began in the British Isles.